By September, the orchard looked dead. 65 acres of apple and pear trees stretched across the hillside, but almost nothing beneath them was alive. Tall weeds covered the ground. Thick brush crowded the trunks. Vines climbed into the branches. Dead leaves formed damp mats beneath the trees, hiding fallen fruit and creating perfect shelter for pests. From the county road, Mara Whitaker's orchard looked abandoned. The neighboring farmers had stopped pretending otherwise. "She's going to lose the whole thing," Earl Dawson told anyone who asked. Mara heard him. She didn't argue. She was too busy trying to save it. For 3 years, the orchard had been deteriorating. Her father had managed it before her, keeping the rows clean with mowing, herbicides, and hired labor. After he died, Mara inherited the property and a mountain of expenses. She was 31, raising 2 children, and couldn't afford the equipment needed to maintain 65 acres properly. So the weeds won. Then the brush arrived. Then the vines. By spring, some young trees were barely visible beneath the vegetation. Mara tried mowing. The tractor overheated. She tried hiring workers. The cost was more than the orchard produced. She tried clearing sections by hand. After 6 weeks, she had barely finished 2 acres. One evening, Nathan Briggs walked through the orchard with her. He kicked aside a pile of weeds. "This isn't sustainable." Mara nodded. "I know. We need another approach." "I've been looking." Nathan pointed toward a dense patch of brush. "What about goats?" Mara looked at him. "Goats? They'll eat almost anything." Mara laughed. "We need an orchard crew, not a petting zoo." Nathan smiled. "I'm serious." The idea wouldn't leave her alone. Mara began researching goats. She discovered that goats could consume woody brush, vines, weeds, and invasive vegetation that livestock like cattle often ignored. They could reach between trees. They could climb steep slopes. And unlike heavy machinery, they didn't compact the soil nearly as aggressively. But there was a problem. Goats could also destroy an orchard. They could strip bark, eat young branches, damage trees, escape fencing. Mara needed to control exactly where they went. She contacted a local goat grazier named Samuel Reed. Samuel arrived with a trailer and 4 test goats. He walked through the orchard. "How many acres?" 65. He looked toward the overgrown hillside. "That's a lot." "I know. How many goats are you thinking?" Mara hesitated. 175. Samuel stared at her. "You're serious?" "Very." He laughed. "Most people start with 20. I don't have 3 years to experiment." Samuel studied the orchard again. "You'll need portable fencing." "I know." "Water stations." "I know." "Rotation plans." "I know." He smiled. "Then maybe you're ready." Mara didn't simply turn goats loose. She divided the orchard into small grazing zones. The first section contained mature trees with thick trunks. The second had heavy brush. The third had invasive vines. The youngest trees were completely fenced off. Samuel helped install temporary electric netting around the grazing areas. Mara created a schedule. Goats entered one section, cleared it, moved, then the next. The goal wasn't to let them eat everything. It was to make them remove the vegetation Mara couldn't afford to clear mechanically. The first morning, 175 goats arrived. The sound alone was incredible. Bleating, hoofs, fences rattling, children laughing. Mara stood at the gate while the herd waited behind Samuel. Earl Dawson watched from the road. He shook his head. "You're really doing this?" Mara smiled. "Yes." With 175 goats. 175. Earl laughed. "This ought to be interesting." The gate opened. The goats poured into the first section. For several minutes, nothing dramatic happened. Then they started eating. Not the grass. The brush. One goat grabbed a vine. Another attacked a thorny shrub. A third climbed onto a fallen tree and began stripping leaves from branches. Within an hour, the ground looked different. By evening, entire patches of vegetation had disappeared. Mara walked through the section with Nathan. He stared at the cleared ground. "They're actually doing it." Mara nodded. "Better than the tractor." "Don't tell the tractor." She laughed. The first week went almost perfectly. The goats cleared dense weeds around the mature trees. They consumed young brush. They stripped invasive vines from fence lines. They opened paths that hadn't been visible in years. Mara began discovering things beneath the vegetation. Old irrigation pipes. Forgotten drainage channels. Trees she had thought were dead. Even a collapsed wooden ladder from her father's orchard days. But the goats were revealing another problem. Some trees were damaged. Not badly, but enough. Mara immediately changed the grazing plan. The goats were moved away from sensitive areas. Tree guards were installed around vulnerable trunks. Samuel adjusted the herd's rotation. Mara realized something important. The goats weren't the solution by themselves. They were a tool, and the person using the tool mattered. By the third week, the difference was impossible to ignore. The western hillside had transformed. Instead of a wall of weeds, the orchard floor was visible. Sunlight reached the soil. Air moved beneath the trees. Fallen fruit could be collected. Mara discovered dozens of young apple trees that had been buried under brush. Nathan counted them. 43. Mara stared. 43 trees we thought we'd lost. Then Samuel called from farther down the row. You need to see this. Mara hurried over. He was standing beside an old pear tree. Its branches were covered with new green growth. Mara touched the trunk. This tree was dying. Samuel smiled. Maybe it was just being buried. But the biggest test hadn't arrived yet. The orchard was entering harvest season, and Mara had to find out whether clearing the ground would actually improve production, or whether she'd simply spent money renting 175 goats to make the farm look better. Then she noticed something unusual. Bees were returning. Birds were returning. And for the first time in years, sunlight reached the orchard floor. Mara looked across the 65 acres. The trees weren't dead. They had been suffocating, and the goats had just given them room to breathe. But Mara still didn't know whether the transformation would continue. Because beneath the newly cleared soil was a second problem, one that had been hidden for years and could determine whether the orchard survived at all. The hidden problem was beneath the trees. For years, Mara had assumed the orchard's decline came from weeds, pests, and neglect. But once the goats cleared the ground, she noticed something else. The soil was hard. Water wasn't soaking into it properly. After rain, puddles formed between the rows. Then the ground dried into a crust. Mara called Professor Laura Jensen, an agricultural specialist who had helped her with the orchard before. Laura walked the property for nearly 2 hours. Finally, she crouched and dug into the soil. This isn't dead soil. Mara looked at her. Then what is it? Compacted soil. Laura explained that years of machinery traffic, bare ground, and repeated mowing had damaged the soil structure. The roots weren't getting the water and air they needed. Mara looked toward the goats. So clearing the weeds wasn't enough. No, Laura smiled. But you've already solved the first problem. Mara changed the grazing strategy again. Instead of keeping the orchard completely bare, she began using the goats to manage vegetation while leaving selected ground cover intact. She also planted clover and low-growing grasses between certain rows. The goats were moved through sections only when necessary. Then they were removed. This time, the goal wasn't destruction. It was balance. Mara began composting manure from the herd and applying it carefully to selected areas. She added organic material to the worst soil. She opened blocked drainage channels. She repaired old irrigation lines the goats had helped uncover. Slowly, the orchard began functioning as a system again. Then came spring. Mara expected a few blossoms. Instead, the trees exploded with them. White apple blossoms covered the hillsides. Pink pear blossoms appeared along the eastern rows. Bees moved from tree to tree. The orchard looked completely different. Lily ran through the rows shouting, "Mom, look!" Mara followed her. The trees were blooming everywhere. Nathan stood beside her. "That's a lot of flowers." Mara smiled. "I'll take it." But flowering didn't guarantee a harvest. A late frost threatened the entire county. Farmers covered young trees. Some burned frost control fires. Others simply waited. Mara couldn't protect 65 acres individually, so she focused on the healthiest sections. The goats were moved away from the orchard entirely. Irrigation systems were checked. Windbreaks were inspected. The family waited. The frost came. Temperatures dropped below freezing overnight. The next morning, Mara walked through the orchard. Some blossoms were damaged. Others survived. She wouldn't know the final outcome for weeks. By June, tiny fruit had appeared. Apples, pears, hundreds of them, then thousands. Nathan began counting. Mara stopped him. "Don't." He laughed. "Why?" "Because I don't want to get excited." But she was already excited. The orchard was producing again. The biggest surprise came at harvest. The fruit wasn't merely abundant. It was better. The apples were larger. The pears were cleaner. There was less disease. The orchard floor was easier to maintain. Workers could move between the rows. Fruit that had once fallen into thick weeds could now be collected quickly. Mara's harvest nearly doubled compared with the previous year, and her costs were lower. She hadn't needed to mow constantly. She had reduced herbicide use. She hadn't hired enormous crews to clear brush. The goats had done the hardest work. Earl Dawson visited during harvest. He stood at the edge of the orchard, staring at the rows. "Is this the same place?" Mara laughed. "Pretty much." He pointed toward the goats grazing in a distant fence section. "I still can't believe that worked." Mara smiled. "It wasn't just the goats." Earl nodded. "Fair." She pointed toward the soil. "They cleared the brush. Then we fixed the soil. Then the trees had what they needed." Earl looked at the heavy fruit hanging from the branches. "How much did you harvest?" Mara told him. His eyebrows rose. "That's almost twice last year." "Almost." He shook his head. Everyone thought the orchard was finished. Mara looked across the hillside. "So did I." The story spread quickly. Other orchard owners began visiting. Some wanted to rent goats. Others wanted to copy Mara's grazing system. She warned them not to simply release a huge herd into an orchard. You have to protect young trees. You have to rotate the animals. You have to watch the soil. And you have to know what the goats are eating. The goats had solved one problem. Mara had to solve the rest. By the following year, she had expanded the system. The goats grazed only when vegetation became excessive. Between grazing periods, cover crops protected the soil. Compost improved fertility. Native flowers were planted along the edges. Bird habitat was preserved. Mara even left several areas intentionally wild. The orchard became more diverse than it had been in decades. And somehow, it became easier to manage. The 175 goats became part of the farm's identity. Visitors came to see them. Children loved them. Farmers studied them. Mara began offering seasonal grazing services to neighboring orchards. That created another source of income. Instead of simply maintaining her own property, she could send controlled goat herds to help other farms manage difficult vegetation. The animals that had saved her orchard began helping save others. 3 years after Mara first opened the gate, she stood at the highest point of the property. 65 acres stretched below her. The trees were healthy. The soil was covered. The rows were manageable. The goats grazed peacefully behind portable fencing. The orchard no longer looked abandoned. It looked alive. Nathan joined her. "Remember what Earl said?" Mara smiled. "What?" "He said the orchard was finished." She laughed. "Everybody said that." Nathan looked down the hill. "And now?" Mara watched Lily feed a goat near the barn. "Now they want to know how we did it." Earl eventually became one of those people. He started using goats on his own property. Not 175, 25. Mara laughed when she heard. "He's learning." Nathan smiled. Slowly. Mara never claimed goats were magic. They weren't. They could damage trees. They could overgraze. They could escape. They required planning. But when used carefully, they could accomplish something machinery couldn't do as cheaply or naturally. They could turn unwanted vegetation into movement, manure, and eventually healthier soil. And in Mara's case, they gave an orchard that everyone had abandoned one more chance. The final harvest was the largest the farm had seen in nearly a decade. Mara stood beside a loaded fruit wagon while Lily held a basket of apples. "Mom." "Yeah." "Are we keeping all the goats?" Mara laughed. "No." Lily looked disappointed. "We're keeping enough." She glanced toward the pasture. "Because they're workers." Lily smiled. "Goat workers." "Exactly.